Hello there, my name is lillypiri and in today's video I'm going to be making this deer automaton. I was inspired by my love of deer and woodwork and automata. As you can see here, I have a very small but nice collection of things that move. I started out with a sketch that was way more complicated than my current skill and toolset allows. I tested things out with a very sad cardboard model. I made a cutout I could trace around and used old plywood offcuts and doweling that I already had in my workshop. I then cut these out on my scroll saw, making sure to make the middle one not have any legs and the two outer pieces to not have a tail. Once the pieces were cut out, I sanded down the roughed edges with 120 grit sandpaper, making sure to go with the grain to prevent tearing. These were then glued together and clamped one layer at a time. You can clamp multiple layers, but I find that they drift too much. I also prefer F-clamps as you don't need too much hand strength to use them. I had also cut out 4 pieces of rectangular wood. 3 were from a project I'm still working on. I used these to make a crude box. A box with dovetail edges would be much nicer, but dovetailing is a skill I need to acquire first. I carefully clamped these as well. Clamping helps to really stick things together properly. I then did some shaping with my Dremel and a carving knife. I then sanded it smooth, first with 120 grit sandpaper, then 240 grit. You can feel when it reaches the right amount of smoothness. I used GAC 100 to prepare the surface for painting, 2 coats and sanding with 240 grit in between and after. Then there was a lot of drilling and cutting pieces out to make the mechanism. I used an oddly shaped piece of wood to create a varied up and down motion. I didn't account for it turning around quite so much, so I had to do a bit of experimentation. First with a flat bit of wood, then with wire, before settling on the original design but with bits of balsa wood to stop it from turning. I didn't follow any instruction on how to do this, just looked at GIFs of other automata to understand how they work. If you do know of any good books on the subject, please share them with me. Now I was happy with it, but it definitely needed a handle. Here's how all the pieces look together in the end. The movement isn't perfect, but that's okay. I like to think imperfection adds to the charm of handmade things. I used some balsa wood inside to keep the dowel from coming out. Once the main parts were all glued together, I took the deer off its circle and started painting it. It took about an hour and a half to paint, and I used one of my old sketches as reference for colours. I'm using titanium white, raw sienna, raw umber and Mars black. Painting something 3D like this meant that I was toning it quite a bit, and even then I didn't get the placement of the eye quite right the first time. It was a happy little mistake that I amended later on. I dry brushed quite a lot of this to get texture and fur-like detail. And here's the part where I decided to move that eye over a little bit. I introduced blue for the eyes. I thought I could just use black and white and rely on the yellow of the raw sienna to trick the eye into thinking it was blue. Sometimes this works, but it didn't here. I decided to make the cheeks a little bit rosy with some permanent rose. You can see here that I'm using a very fine brush to do some almost dry brushing for the fur texture around the face. The colour didn't seem red enough for me here, so I painted over it with raw sienna mixed with some permanent rose and some white. And that's the last spot. Here's the final piece. I always say this, but this was so fun to make. Woodworking teaches me to be patient and do things in small amounts. You must have respect for the tools being used and stop when you are tired. Thank you so much for joining me. I really hope this inspires you to go and create something beautiful for yourself. I'll see you next time.